Many people think of Albert Einstein and they think of the crazy hair and E equals MC squared. Many people don't realize he struggled to find work, he was rejected, and he contributed to some of the most brilliant and just completely conceptually insane ideas in all of human history. So I'm going to go over how a struggling young man became the face of science itself and who everyone thinks of when they think of physics and even all of science. Albert Einstein was born in Ulm, Germany in 1879, and he was an absolutely brilliant child, but oftentimes a lot of brilliant children kind of struggle because they tend to realize early that they're oftentimes more intelligent than their teachers are. But Albert Einstein, he ended up going to university at, I think it was 1900, so he would have been 21. And eventually he started working at a patent office or as a technical advisor, which he decided who deserved patents on what things, and which is pretty, I mean, that's pretty big so early in life. That's a pretty fulfilling life even for just doing that, let alone, I mean, that it just wasn't enough for him. So in 1902, he started working at the patent office, and this gave him enough time to start working on physics on the side. And over the next 3 years, he just had a culmination of ideas that all intersected in 1905. And not even the year of it was 6 months stretch that he did his PhD dissertation, which estimated the size of molecules with inside I forget what the liquid was, but I think that was like March, April of that year. He did the photoelectric effect, which eventually resulted in his Nobel Prize winning in 1921, 16 years later, because the photoelectric effect describes the duality of waves and particles, and that's kind of hard to prove when it's so conceptually challenging, especially in the very beginning of the 20th century. He did Brownian motion, which eventually led scientists to believe fully that atoms are the building blocks of matter. He did the special theory of relativity, which is often cited as the most important scientific discovery in all of physics. It's absolutely incredible. And then the fifth one, he photoelectric effect. Oops. Oh, he developed the mass energy equivalence principle, which is just the E equals mc squared. That's kind of one that he's most remembered for, but it kind of slipped my mind because it's kind of just a result of the other work that he had done. Which E equals mc squared eventually gave him the credibility of helping the bomb be produced, which really he didn't do much, which I'll kind of go over later. But all this in the miracle year is what they call it. He's often credited with achieving 4 of the feats that he did in that year, which is the part of the miracle year, but really there are 5. He's just such that dude that they just don't give him all 5 within that miracle year, which is, I think, pretty incredible. In 1907, he came up with what is called the equivalence principle, which is just a principle in which he realized that acceleration, like on a ship or just moving through space at all, is equivalent to the feeling that you would get on gravity, so just 9.8 meters per second squared. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference if you had the same acceleration, but it wasn't from a celestial body. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference at all, as long as you didn't have outside reference frame to be able to reference that to. In 1911, he predicted that light would get bent through gravity. Even though light is massless, he predicted that light would get bent through gravity because this kind of leads to the theory of general relativity, but he predicted that light would get curved by stars and large celestial objects, which eventually was proved in 1919, which this is actually what sent him into international fame. he just became ultra popular after that. And then 2 years later, he would have won the Nobel Prize for that. The photoelectric effect, which is particle wave duality, which he didn't come up with that whole thing, but he theorized that it was both a wave, and I guess that's pretty much there. In 1915, he created the general theory of relativity, which is, instead of gravity being a force, which Isaac Newton came up with like 300 years before him, like 250 years before him, he just revolutionized everything and called it a fabric. He melded space and time into a fabric. And this just revolutionized the theory of physics in general, because objects were just following the easiest curve instead of there actually being a force that was, and it actually solved a lot of Newton's inaccuracies when it came to extremes in certain situations. And he came up with a special relativity, which just taking a few givens, that the speed of light was always constant no matter what you viewed from. Even if you're going 99% at the speed of light, if you measured it, it would still go the speed of light. And the time goes the same for all observers going at the same speed. So in 1916, Einstein predicted gravitational waves, which are waves that are produced from black holes orbiting each other. Because if you think about it, since a black hole is just a singularity, it's just a point in space, if they come in contact with each other, they would never hit straight on. So you get this weird orbiting, and eventually it's just incredibly vast and very rapid. The RPMs would be enormous, which is what creates the wavelength of the gravitational wave. And he theorized that in 1916. And with LIGO in 2016, we eventually figured out that it is completely true, and we actually detected them. 100 years later, this dude's just completely incredibly intelligent. In 1917, through working some of his equations, he came up with cosmological expansion, which he actually quotes it as one of his largest blunders in life. But we actually used it. I think it's like 73 kilometers per second per megaparsec, and we use this constant to this day. And he just, even when he screws up, this dude just gets it right. It's insane. In 1970, he realized that atoms could be simulated to create identical photons, which cause lasers. This is why I kind of like these research videos. I didn't even know about this one, and that's pretty fascinating. You can that's how many lights get formed, and lasers are pretty important in eventually space travel. We intend to use lasers to launch like a sort of space sail ship. I'll eventually go over that. But in 1925, he worked with Satyendra Bose, which they came up with a Bose-Einstein condensate, which is I think it's theoretical. I'm not claiming to really be an expert on anything, but a Bose-Einstein condensate, which is a state of matter in which when you get to right around absolute zero, just the happenings of the way that the particles react is just significantly different, and it goes over those different reactions with that. And it's just, the way they can theorize things and have it proven is just, I think, absolutely, it's insane. And then just thinking of something that was not previously stepped through and put like a skeleton of a framework rather of intellectual thought is just incredible to me. You're literally rewriting the science that had come before you. In 1935, he worked with Rosen and Podolsky, and they came up with the Podolsky-Rosen-Einstein paradox, which kind of started the quantum mechanics, and they realized that quantum mechanics was incomplete, and it contributed to it by realizing that quantum entanglement is a thing, and he actually described that as calling it a spooky action at a distance. He really didn't like quantum entanglement. Another quote of his was, "God doesn't play dice with the universe. It shouldn't be random. There's a larger structure that's causing that," which I can see an argument of that, but at the moment there's kind of no point to think that because we don't really know what it would be. In 1939 is the year that he most got attributed to contributing to the atomic bomb, because all he did was write a letter to Roosevelt that Germany was working on a nuclear bomb, and that caused the USA to start working on the nuclear bomb. He didn't really help physically with it, but he eventually came to regret that. But we kind of opened Pandora's box that was going to be created somehow, regardless, whatever avenue we had to take to do so. And then from 1920s until his death, he both tried to contribute to the creation of a unified theory, unifying quantum mechanics, which he often fought with Niels Bohr about, and gravity, which are the big and the tiny. And if you can unify that, you kind of understand the whole structure of it, which the string theory is an attempt to try to connect those. But he worked pretty much all his life on trying to unify that gravity and quantum mechanics. And then also he had a lot of humanitarian efforts after the 1920s, because he always had peace thoughts that everyone shouldn't really be fighting, equality. But in 1919, when they proved that the curvature of the sun changes the way that light happens in an eclipse, and they proved that he was right, he kind of blew up in fame. He became famous internationally, and he started pushing his more peaceful ideals, and everyone knew him as a pacifist, which I think is generally pretty good. I mean, if we can avoid war, obviously we should. And then eventually that turned into de-weaponizing all the nukes and getting rid of those, because he would have died just like 10 years after the first nuclear bomb was dropped. I think that's about all I can think of. Well, there are some negative ideals that Einstein would be eventually attributed. He was kind of, when you become that intelligent, you're going to be kind of distant emotionally oftentimes, just because if your whole life is just based around physics work, relationships can be really difficult. So with his first wife, but through both his marriages, he had a lot of affairs, and he was just known to not really put boundaries around what he could do and what he couldn't do. And both wives kind of seemed to put up with it, which is, I mean, it's determination, but obviously nowadays the standards are going to be a little bit different than more than 100 years ago. But they eventually had I think two kids. Well, his one of his sons was eventually developed schizophrenia quite young, and when he moved away in Germany in 1933 because of Hitler, he left his son, and he actually never saw him again. They continued to write notes back and forth, but they never met physically again. And I forget his wife's name, but she ended up needing to be the caretaker for when he left, and she ended up taking all the responsibilities of those children, and he was kind of remote, just stuck in his science and such. Eventually, he actually got romantically involved with his cousin before his first wife and him split. I think it was like 6 years before they actually split, and he eventually married her until she died in, I think, 36. And his first wife was actually like a really intellectually brilliant mind herself. She kind of stopped and started helping him. She didn't pursue as much work independently after they started getting together, but she was like the top of her, like, as far as women go, she was like the only woman around that time that was studying at that level. It was like absolutely incredible. But his second wife, which was his cousin, she wasn't quite the intellectual in regards to academia, but she was pretty good at kind of managing his life, and she kind of eventually became that. As much as a companion, she also became a managerial person who organized his speeches and his work and pretty much everything that he did day to day. And she ended up finding a good niche in that. But she knew about a few of the times that he had cheated on her, and she seemed to put up with that. Obviously not emotionally fine with it. No public statements were made about it, but he definitely had his flaws, but as all humans do. There were also some findings in his earlier works when he was like 30, between his 30 and 40s. He had commented on the Indians and other Asian cultures being quite dirty, but he just seemed to put that out there as something that he noted, not necessarily something that you should treat races differently for, because he fought avidly for racism to be stopped, because frankly, if you treat different races wrong, it's kind of seems like an emotional underdevelopment on your part. This is about all I had for the video. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. If you could leave a like, comment. I really want comments. That's kind of the goal of this channel, to be honest. I just want a nice discussion. I would really like to have discourse between me and the comments. That just sounds really, really enjoyable. But regardless, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.